A cabin camera would later show something none of the passengers noticed in the moment: the man in the worn coat glancing at his watch 3 times before boarding, not from nerves, but because he was already 30 minutes behind a schedule only 2 people on the plane knew about. Get that poor man out of my seat. People dressed like him belong in economy, not next to me. The seat is mine. Remove him before we miss departure. Men like you don't belong up front. Every passenger in first class was watching when Daniel Hayes rose from the seat he had legally purchased, one hand holding his daughter's backpack, the other steadying her trembling fingers. His worn coat, scuffed shoes, and quiet expression had already convinced the crew he mattered less than the wealthy woman now settling into his place. No one examined the boarding pass she'd slid beneath her palm. No one asked why Daniel stayed so calm as his name vanished from the cabin record. And no one noticed the small black card that slipped from his wallet for half a second, stamped with an emblem the flight attendant almost placed before it disappeared back into his coat. What none of them knew yet, Daniel Hayes hadn't boarded that plane by accident. For 6 weeks, a folder on a locked laptop in his office had been growing heavier with complaints just like the one about to happen to him. He'd come to see, with his own eyes, whether the rumors were true. He was about to get his answer faster than he expected. Daniel Hayes stepped into first class of Meridian Sky Airlines with one hand resting on his 10-year-old daughter's shoulder. Nothing about him suggested wealth. His brown wool coat had gone soft at the elbows. His shirt was plain, open at the collar. The leather of his shoes had worn thin at the edges. Lily followed close behind in a cream sweater, hugging a small navy backpack to her chest. They were flying to Denver for a memorial service for Lily's late mother, and a school science fair the next morning. Daniel had booked the earliest direct flight so she could arrive rested. He'd paid, in full, for seats 1A and 1B. He checked the boarding passes once more, settled Lily into 1B, tucked her backpack beneath the seat, and took the window in 1A. Lily opened her sketchbook and began tracing the outline of a wing. For a few minutes, they looked like any father and daughter starting a long trip. Then Diane Whitfield walked in, and the air in the cabin changed before she said a word. She moved down the aisle in a fitted white suit, a nervous assistant trailing behind with a leather case. Several passengers recognized her, CEO of Whitfield Corp., and straightened in their seats. Diane barely glanced at them. Her eyes were fixed on 1A. She stopped beside Daniel, studied his coat, his shoes, then turned to Sarah Reyes, the senior flight attendant. "Why is this man in my seat?" Sarah checked Diane's boarding pass, a different seat, farther back. Then Daniel's, 1A, no ambiguity. For one clean second, the truth was obvious. Then Sarah noticed the Whitfield Corp logo on the assistant's folder, and remembered the talk of a corporate travel contract worth pursuing. Her smile tightened. "There may have been a system error," she said, though she knew there hadn't been. Daniel held out his pass. "My daughter and I were assigned these seats when we booked." Diane didn't look at it. "People can print anything at home. I requested this seat weeks ago." "Your request doesn't change the ticket I bought," Daniel said evenly. Lily looked up from her sketchbook. Sarah's expression hardened. Not because Daniel had raised his voice, he hadn't, but because he'd contradicted a powerful passenger in front of witnesses. She asked him to step into the aisle so they could sort this out quietly. Daniel wouldn't leave Lily alone, and asked Sarah to verify the reservation through the system. She tapped at her tablet, then angled the screen away from him, and announced the airline needed 1A for an operational accommodation. She offered him a seat near the back of economy. When he asked about Lily, she said the girl could stay in 1B alone, or they could both take whatever seats opened up after boarding. Lily's knuckles went white around her sketchbook. "You're proposing," Daniel said, "to separate a 10-year-old from her only parent because another passenger wants our seat." Sarah lowered her voice, warned him not to make this harder than it needed to be. Diane laughed. Someone who truly belonged up here would understand discretion. A man across the aisle lifted his phone, pretending to check a message while filming. A woman whispered to her companion and eyed Daniel's coat. Lily noticed every glance, and lowered her head like she'd done something shameful. Daniel leaned close and told her, quietly, to keep breathing. Sarah called Gary Mercer, the terminal manager, and told him an uncooperative passenger was holding up departure. Gary arrived already irritated at the thought of a delay. He heard Sarah's version first. Priority client, difficult passenger, and never asked Daniel for his. He glanced at Diane's jewelry, recognized her name, and made his decision before he'd looked at a single boarding pass. He told Daniel the airline reserved the right to reassign seats for operational needs, and offered a modest travel voucher. Daniel asked him to put the operational reason in writing. Gary refused, and warned that security would remove him if he kept resisting. Diane crossed her arms, watching with open satisfaction. This is taking far too long. Move him before he ruins the flight for everyone. Lily looked up at her father, eyes wet. Did we do something wrong? Daniel read Sarah's name badge. He read Gary's ID. He noted that the seat assignment field on the tablet had already changed, though he'd never agreed to anything. That detail mattered to him more than the insult did. Without anger, he folded his boarding pass, set it on the armrest, and stood. Diane stepped aside just enough to let him pass, smiling. Next time, buy a ticket that matches your place in the world. A few passengers looked away, uncomfortable. No one spoke up. Daniel took Lily's hand and walked toward the door. Behind them, Diane lowered herself into 1A and rested her hand over his folded boarding pass without reading the name on it. At the threshold, Daniel paused beside Sarah. Changing a passenger's record without consent isn't a seating preference. It's a serious decision. Gary told him to keep moving. He did. They weren't taken back into the terminal. Gary had a gate agent hold them in the jet bridge while the crew hunted for 2 economy seats. Lily stood pressed against her father's side, still red-faced, refusing to look through the open door where Diane now had the window seat that had been his. Why didn't you tell them who you are? Lily finally asked. Not out of pride, out of confusion. Daniel crouched to her eye level. Because if they only respect us after they learn I have power, they never respected us at all. But they made everyone think we were lying. Truth doesn't get weaker just because a room full of people failed to recognize it. Lily didn't fully understand, but she heard the certainty in his voice, and held his hand tighter. Daniel watched the gate agent screen over her shoulder. His name had been pulled from 1A, dropped into unassigned economy, and marked as a voluntary change. Lily's seat was still technically tied to 1B, which made it look, on paper, like she'd be flying without him. No signature. No record of refusal. Sarah hadn't just taken his seat, she'd rewritten the record to make it look legal. He asked the agent if the change had been logged as voluntary. She hesitated, glanced at Gary. Gary stepped between Daniel and the screen and told him the internal system was none of his concern. That's when the twist the folder on his laptop had been building toward finally arrived at the gate in person. James Calloway, Meridian's regional executive director, had been doing an unannounced review of morning gate operations when word reached him that a seating dispute was delaying a flight. He expected an entitled passenger or a flustered agent. Instead he found Daniel Hayes under the jet bridge lights with Lily pressed to his side. James stopped so fast the supervisor behind him nearly collided with his back. Chairman Hayes. Gary turned, irritated at the interruption, and then the words landed. His face went blank. The gate agent froze mid-motion. The supervisor straightened like he'd been struck. Because here was twist number 2, Daniel Hayes wasn't merely a wealthy man traveling incognito. He was the reason the last 6 weeks of discrimination complaints against Meridian had crossed a single desk without anyone connecting them, his own. He'd flown this route, on this day, specifically because it was the route with the most complaints on file, and he'd told no one, not even James, that he was coming. James asked, carefully, why the chairman of Meridian Sky was standing in a jet bridge instead of seated on the aircraft. Daniel didn't answer directly. He asked whether a first-class passenger's seat could be reassigned without consent. Whether a minor could be separated from a parent without written approval. Whether a terminal manager could authorize that without documenting a real operational reason. James looked at Gary. Gary had nothing. Daniel asked if the original data could be recovered. James said every change would be timestamped to the employee account that made it. Daniel asked if the aircraft could legally depart with an unauthorized modification still sitting in the manifest. James didn't answer. He already knew what came next. Gary tried to recover, calling it a misunderstanding caused by schedule pressure, insisting Daniel and Lily were about to be reseated, that there was no need to escalate. Daniel said, "I'm not asking for my seat back." Gary blinked, thrown. Daniel kept going. Had Sarah verified Diane's assignment before moving him? Had Gary reviewed the reservation history before approving it? Had either of them confirmed the new manifest matched the people actually sitting in those seats? Gary admitted he'd simply trusted Sarah's summary. Daniel told James to lock the reservation data immediately, preserve every version of the manifest, and stop anyone from touching it further. He ordered the flight held, and asked James to bring Laura Pierce, Meridian's Director of Legal and Compliance, to the gate before anyone was allowed to board again. Gary called it revenge dressed as procedure. A suspension would mean delays, missed connections, real cost. Daniel answered that a passenger record no one could trust was worse than a late flight. James was already on the phone. Inside the cabin, the interphone rang. Sarah's face tightened as she listened. She looked at Diane, checking her watch. Sarah told the captain ground operations had suspended departure for a passenger verification review. Confusion rippled through the plane. The door stayed open. Ground crew gathered outside it. No one could explain why boarding had frozen. Diane demanded a timeline. Sarah didn't have one. Diane accused the crew of incompetence, reminded her that important people had schedules that didn't bend for administrative mistakes. Sarah tried to reassure her, but her earlier confidence, the confidence that had pushed Daniel out of his seat, had drained out of her. Her tablet returned the same locked screen no matter what she tried. She looked toward Gary through the open door. He wouldn't meet her eyes. 5 minutes after Daniel had been forced out of 1A, the cabin speakers crackled. All passengers were to gather their belongings and disembark for a mandatory ground review. Protest rolled through the cabin. Some assumed a mechanical fault, others whispered, security threat. Phones came out again. Diane refused to move at first, insisting on an explanation. When Sarah, visibly shaken now, repeated that everyone had to leave, Diane pointed at the folded boarding pass still trapped under her hand and complained that the delay had started right after they removed the troublesome passenger. Sarah said nothing. She rose eventually, furious at being herded out like anyone else, her assistant trailing with the leather case. The moment she stepped onto the jet bridge, her expression changed. Daniel wasn't standing there alone anymore. James Calloway stood beside him, speaking low and urgent. Laura Pierce had arrived with 2 members of the compliance team. Senior airport managers hovered nearby, waiting for instructions instead of giving them. Lily still held her father's hand. But everyone around him now watched him differently. Gary stood off to the side, pale, silent. As passengers filed out, their complaints dissolved into confused murmuring. People who'd smirked at Daniel's coat now stared at the executives surrounding him. Sarah, last off the plane, watched James turn to Daniel and say, "Chairman Hayes," again, and the words moved through the jet bridge like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Diane stopped mid-stride. Her eyes moved from Daniel's plain coat to Laura, to James, to the assembled leadership. For the first time all morning, she had nothing to say. Gary reached Daniel before the last of the passengers had cleared out, all his earlier confidence gone. He lowered his voice, hoping the executives nearby wouldn't hear him plead, called it a serious misunderstanding, said he'd never meant disrespect, that he'd only been trying to keep the flight on time. Then panic made him say the thing that undid him completely. "If I'd known you were Chairman Hayes, I would have handled this completely differently." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, Lily still at his side. "That's the problem, Gary. You think we deserved fair treatment only after you learned my title." Gary tried to walk it back. Daniel didn't let him. The boarding passes had been valid before James recognized him. Lily had been a child traveling with her father before anyone knew who he was. The rules protecting passengers hadn't suddenly gotten more important because the chairman happened to be involved. Gary said he'd trusted Sarah's account, believed the reassignment was operationally necessary. Daniel asked what operational reason moved a paying passenger out of 1A into unassigned economy while seating another passenger there without checking her ticket. Gary had no answer. He looked to Diane, hoping she'd back him up. She stood with her arms folded, caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. Daniel turned to the gathered passengers. The flight hadn't been grounded because his pride was hurt. It had been grounded because the official passenger record had been altered without authorization, and a seat assignment ties a person's identity to a physical location on that aircraft. Falsify that, and the airline could no longer promise the manifest matched the people actually on board. This wasn't a private insult an apology could erase. It was a failure of procedure, accountability, and safety. Laura Pierce set up at a portable terminal with her compliance team, requesting the original reservation file, the live manifest, employee access logs, and every change made during boarding. Because Daniel had ordered the data locked early, the full sequence had survived. She turned the screen so James and Daniel could see it. The original booking, Daniel Hayes in 1A, Lily Hayes in 1B, both paid, confirmed, checked in without a single flag. Diane Whitfield's ticket, a different first-class seat, farther back. No duplicate booking. No system glitch. The modification log told the rest. Sarah's account had pulled Daniel from 1A minutes before departure, dropped him into unassigned economy, moved Diane into his seat, and tagged the whole thing as voluntary. No signature. No confirmation. Nothing. Laura asked Sarah when, exactly, Daniel had agreed to any of this. Sarah said she'd assumed standing up and leaving counted as acceptance. Laura reminded her he'd only stood after being threatened with removal by security. Compliance rules don't let an employee log coercion as consent. Sarah said she'd been under pressure, trying to keep the cabin calm. Laura asked why she'd ignored the boarding pass in his hand. Sarah said Diane was a high-value passenger who'd claimed the seat had been requested in advance. The ticket record showed no such request had ever been approved. The authorization log showed Gary's manager account approving the change less than a minute after Sarah entered it, no review of Daniel's pass, no private conversation with him, no check of the reservation history, no consideration of what separating Lily from her father would mean. Gary said Sarah had described Daniel as disruptive and he believed swift action was needed. Standing quietly beside a seat I legally paid for became disruptive, Daniel said, the moment I refused to hand it to someone wealthier. Gary had nothing left to say. Ben Carter, a junior flight attendant who'd hung back at the edge of the group, finally stepped forward. He'd been in the cabin during boarding and had seen Sarah's first, correct check of the tickets. When Laura asked if any crew member had seen the seat map before the change, Ben raised his hand. Sarah shot him a look. James told him to speak freely. Ben pulled out his phone. He'd photographed the original seating chart earlier, after the cabin tablet briefly froze, meaning only to double-check meal orders if it happened again. The photo was time-stamped before Daniel had been removed, Daniel in 1A, Lily in 1B, Diane in her assigned seat. A second photo, taken after the change, showed the difference plainly. Laura asked if he'd overheard anything between Diane and Sarah beforehand. Ben hesitated, then admitted Diane had complained about her seat near the galley and mentioned that Whitfield Corp would soon be choosing an airline for a major corporate travel contract, that employees who understood the needs of important clients tended to be remembered when it came time for recommendations. Sarah looked at the floor. Ben said her attitude toward Daniel had shifted right after that conversation, from acknowledging his past was valid to calling it a system error. Diane stepped forward, accusing Ben of twisting an offhand comment, insisting she'd never ordered anyone to falsify anything, that she'd only expected service appropriate to someone bringing serious business to the airline. Laura told her the investigation would determine how much her pressure had contributed. But her title didn't erase what had happened. A passenger who'd filmed the confrontation from his seat offered the footage. Laura played it while others gathered close enough to hear. It showed Daniel calm beside Lily, Diane standing over him, Sarah refusing to even glance at the pass he held out. It caught Diane questioning whether someone like him belonged in first class, demanding he be removed. It caught Lily asking if they'd done something wrong. And it caught the final image. Diane settling into 1A, Daniel's folded boarding pass trapped under her palm. The passengers who'd laughed, or simply watched, wouldn't meet Daniel's eyes now. Diane still didn't apologize. Instead she accused him of using his position to manufacture a spectacle and damage her reputation over a minor seating dispute, reminding him the Whitfield Corp contract was worth millions to Meridian. And that if he let her be humiliated publicly, the board would hear exactly why the deal fell through. Daniel's expression didn't move. A contract that depends on employees ignoring safety procedure and degrading ordinary passengers isn't an opportunity worth taking. When she suggested he was only reacting emotionally because his daughter had watched it happen, he answered that Lily's presence made the failure more painful, not more serious. The record would have been falsified whether the displaced passenger was a chairman, a mechanic, a teacher, or someone flying for the first time in their life. He wouldn't trade passenger dignity for a contract. Laura suspended Diane's premium account pending review. When Diane tried to walk back toward the gate, security blocked her path. James told her she wouldn't be reboarding or entering the restricted area again. She turned to Sarah, demanding confirmation that she'd never ordered anything illegal. Sarah said nothing. Diane looked around at the passengers who'd watched her take Daniel's seat and realized no one intended to defend her. Security walked her out, her assistant trailing with the leather case. The white suit and the jewelry that had commanded a room 20 minutes earlier now just made her easy to point out from the footage already circulating. Laura turned to Sarah next, revoking her authority to work the flight, suspending her access pending full investigation. Sarah started to cry, said she'd spent years building this career. Daniel didn't answer with cruelty. Just told her the years made it worse, not better, because she'd known the rules and broken them anyway to impress someone powerful. She handed over her badge and was escorted out. Gary lingered, hoping his apology and tenure might still count for something. But Laura's review of the compliance archive turned up the last twist. This wasn't Sarah's first offense, and it wasn't Gary's first cover-up. Several earlier complaints, families separated, passengers pressured into downgrades, had crossed his desk and been marked resolved, with no interviews, no documentation, nothing. Every one of them was in the folder Daniel had already been building for 6 weeks. The complaints lacked evidence, Gary tried. I was keeping minor service issues from piling up. You didn't reduce the problem, Laura said. You buried it. James suspended Gary from all terminal duties and disabled his access. Gary asked Daniel for another chance to explain. The investigation will give you that chance, Daniel said. But you won't be the one holding the records, or the employees who might testify. Daniel stood before the delayed passengers in the gate lounge, Lily quiet beside him, her hand in his. He didn't hide behind James or Laura or his title. He apologized himself for the disruption, explained plainly that everyone had been required to disembark because the manifest could no longer be trusted once it had been altered without authorization. The inconvenience was real, missed connections, disrupted plans. and none of that was excused just because the truth had eventually surfaced. Meridian covered meals, lounge access, rebooking, and compensation for every affected passenger immediately. Several people who'd watched him get humiliated came forward. The man who'd filmed it apologized for staying silent while recording. A woman who'd laughed admitted she'd judged him by his coat before hearing a single fact. Others confessed they'd sensed something was wrong and said nothing, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. Daniel accepted all of it without bitterness, but he didn't tell them the silence had been harmless. Cruelty draws its power not only from the person doing it, but from the crowd that watches and decides not to step in. Lily listened closely, understanding her father wasn't trying to shame anyone. He wanted them to remember, the next time, the person standing alone with no title and no money to protect them. The investigation moved fast, since the records had survived intact. Gary was dismissed for approving falsified passenger data, burying past complaints, and using his position to favor people he judged important. Sarah was terminated for reassigning Daniel's seat without consent, falsely logging it as voluntary, and risking the separation of a child from her only parent. Ben was formally recognized for preserving the original evidence and telling the truth when it would have been easier not to. Daniel recommended him for the airline's leadership program himself. Courage mattered more than obedience without judgment. Before leaving the terminal, Daniel approved a set of reforms across Meridian Sky. No employee could remove a confirmed passenger from their seat to satisfy someone wealthy, famous, or commercially valuable. Any seat change involving a minor required explicit guardian approval. Discrimination complaints would route to an independent review board, not local managers with an incentive to bury them. Employees could refuse instructions that violated procedure without fear of retaliation. And senior executives, including Daniel himself, would fly anonymously at random intervals going forward, no folder, no advance notice, just the same seat and the same treatment as everyone else. When the replacement aircraft was ready, James arranged for Daniel and Lily to have 1A and 1B back. Boarding again, Daniel noticed a tired mother helping her son, his leg in a brace, move slowly through the crowd. He handed them his and Lily's first-class seats without a second thought. James offered to find another premium section for them, Daniel declined, and he and Lily took 2 ordinary seats near the back with everyone else. Once they were settled, Lily asked why he'd given the seats away after fighting so hard to prove they were his. "I never fought for a comfortable seat," he said. "I fought because the rules got broken, and because people started acting like dignity was something you had to be rich enough to afford. Getting back what was taken from us isn't the point. Making sure it can't happen to the next person, that's the point." Lily looked toward the front of the plane, where the boy was already resting against his mother's shoulder, then leaned into her father's arm. As the plane climbed out over the city, the morning stopped feeling like a story about a powerful man revealing who he really was. It became something quieter, a reminder of what power is actually for. Not the ability to take a seat from someone, or silence an employee, or demand obedience. The responsibility to stand next to the people who can't protect themselves, and to fix the system so they never have to stand alone again.